The road to Dust River was nothing more than a red scar on the face of the earth, and the wagon rolling down it was a dying beetle, creaking and groaning its last. Inside, two ghosts sat drowning in whiskey and regret. Their names were Caleb and Loretta Hanley, though names like that deserved to be buried and forgotten. They were arguing, their voices sharp and ugly enough to make the wind itself go quiet. "You and these brats," Caleb snarled, his words sloshing around like the cheap liquor in his gut. "Nothing but dead weight, dragging me down into the mud every single day." Loretta didn't even turn around. She just pulled a frayed shawl over her shoulders, a wall of thin wool against a lifetime of hate. "I'd rather starve," she said, her voice as dry as a bone in the sun, "than feed mouths that only open to whine and never to work." Behind the wagon, four smaller shadows stumbled through the dust. They were the children, the forgotten ones. The youngest, a girl who had barely seen 3 summers, lurched forward, her tiny hands grabbing for the hem of her mother's skirt. "Mama," she pleaded, her voice a tiny, trembling thing. "Take me with you." Loretta ripped the fabric from the child's grasp like she'd been touched by a snake. The little girl tumbled backward into the dirt, her cries swallowed by the vast empty sky. And watching it all was Eva, 19 years old, and her face held no shock, no tears, nothing but the hollowed-out look of someone who had been left behind so many times the wound had finally gone numb. She pulled her younger siblings close, her hands on their small, shaking shoulders. The house behind them was already a skeleton, its bones picked clean and sold off to pay for a losing hand at a dusty card table. The shutters swung on broken hinges. The porch sagged like it was tired of holding up the weight of so much misery. This wasn't new, being left, but this time felt different. This time felt like the end of the world. Eva could still feel the phantom sting of her father's belt from a year ago, when he'd caught her sneaking half her dinner to her little brother. She remembered the dirt floor against her knees, the taste of blood and dust in her mouth. She remembered looking up at Loretta, her own mother, and asking the question that had been burning inside her for years. "If you never meant to love us," she'd whispered through swollen lips, "why did you bring us into this world?" Caleb hadn't let her mother answer. He'd backhanded her so hard her head snapped back, slamming against the wall. "That was the mistake," he'd spat, his eyes wild and red. "The mistake was bringing a flock of useless mouths into this house." And Loretta? She had just stood there, watching, not a word, not a breath, not a single movement to save her own daughter. Now, as the wagon grew smaller and smaller, a speck of dust disappearing into more dust, Eva didn't cry. She just held her brothers and sister tighter, pulling them into a tight knot of survival as the sun bled out across the horizon. The world had already shown her everything it was willing to take away. Tonight, she had no money, no food, and no name she ever wanted to hear again. As the last sliver of light vanished, she looked up at the bruised purple sky and made a promise, not loud enough for the children to hear, but loud enough for the stars. "That name is not mine anymore." That night, huddled under the collapsing porch of the house that was no longer theirs, Eva scraped together enough wet branches and moldy scraps to coax a fire to life. It was a pathetic thing, hissing and spitting more smoke than flame, but it was hers. The children huddled close, their small bodies shivering from a cold that had nothing to do with the wind. The youngest still whimpered for a mother who was already a ghost. Eva didn't speak. She just stared into the weak flames, feeling a different kind of cold settle deep inside her bones. It was the cold of being utterly, completely alone. But as she held her sleeping sister, she felt something else too. A flicker of rage, a stubborn refusal to break. She had no name. She belonged to no one. She was nothing but the keeper of this tiny, struggling flame and the protector of 4 small lives. And in the vast, crushing darkness of the Texas night, she decided that would have to be enough. But as the fire burned down to glowing embers, she got the distinct, chilling feeling that they were being watched. She scanned the dark hills surrounding them, but saw nothing. Just the wind and the shadows and the terrifying thought that they weren't as alone as she believed. What kind of monster watched a starving family from the dark? The next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt alien and hostile. The hoof prints from the wagon were already being erased by the wind, as if the Hanleys had never even existed. Eva's first thought was the watcher from the night before. She scanned the hills again, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Nothing. Just shimmering heat in endless, empty land. Was it a coyote? A drifter? Or just her mind, starved and scared, playing tricks on her? She pushed the fear down. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Food was the only thing that mattered. She left her siblings huddled together, the oldest boy trying to look brave, and set off in search of anything edible. Roots, berries, anything the birds might have missed. Hours later, she returned with a handful of bitter roots and 2 scrawny bird eggs. It was barely enough to quiet the gnawing ache in their stomachs. As darkness fell for the second time, the fear crept back in, colder and sharper than before. The fire she built was even weaker tonight, the wood still damp and smoky. The children cried themselves to sleep, their dreams filled with the warmth of a kitchen they would never see again. Eva stayed awake, her back pressed against the decaying porch wall, a heavy stick clutched in her hands. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to twist into the shape of a man. She fought to stay awake, her eyelids heavy as stones, her body screaming for rest. But she couldn't. She was the only thing standing between her family and whatever lurked in the dark. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she must have drifted off, because when she blinked her eyes open, the sky was just beginning to turn a soft, bruised gray. And something was different. At the edge of the porch, placed so neatly it couldn't possibly have been an accident, was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. This was it. The watcher. Had they come while she slept? Her mind raced. Was it a trap? Was it poisoned? Who would leave food for a pack of orphans in the middle of nowhere? People in Dust River didn't have that kind of kindness. They were hard people, carved from hard land. She crept forward, her stick held out in front of her like a sword. With a trembling hand, she nudged the bundle. It was heavy. Slowly, carefully, she unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a loaf of bread, still faintly warm, a flask of water, and several thick slices of cured meat. Her stomach screamed with hunger. It smelled like heaven, but her mind screamed with suspicion. This was too good to be true. It was a trick, a cruel joke, or worse. Maybe it was a payment for something she didn't yet understand. She looked at her sleeping siblings, their faces pale and thin in the pre-dawn light. They were starving. She was starving. Could she risk it? Could she afford not to? She broke off a tiny piece of the bread, smaller than her fingernail, and put it on her tongue. She waited, her heart hammering, for the searing pain of poison. Nothing. It was just bread. The most delicious bread she had ever tasted. But the question still burned in her mind, hotter than any fire. Who was leaving these gifts? And more importantly, what did they want in return? The food didn't last long. With 4 hungry children, it was gone by noon. But it had bought them time. It had pushed back the gnawing hunger just enough for Eva to think. The mystery of the gifts consumed her. It was an act of kindness so profound it felt like a threat. Kindness was a currency she didn't understand, and she was terrified of the price. That night, she barely slept, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond their pitiful fire. But no one came. The next morning it happened again. In the exact same spot, there was a new offering, a neat pile of dry, split firewood, perfectly cut kindling stacked right beside it. Eva stared at it, her confusion warring with a desperate sense of gratitude. This wasn't just random charity. The firewood was expertly chopped. This was the work of someone strong, someone practical, someone who knew what it took to survive out here. But it was also silent, secretive. It felt like they were being observed, like specimens in a jar, by an invisible force. Her siblings were too young to understand her fear. To them, it was magic. Food appearing from nowhere, wood to make a warm fire. They laughed for the first time in days as she built a proper blaze, one that pushed back the shadows and warmed their chilled bones. But Eva couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She felt a presence in the hills, in the way the wind whispered through the broken shutters of the old house. On the third day, a small tin of beans and a heavy wool blanket appeared. The blanket was old and worn, but it was clean, and it smelled faintly of saddle leather and wood smoke. That smell, it was a clue. This wasn't a ghost. It was a rider, someone with a horse, someone who lived nearby. Her fear began to curdle into a grim determination. She would not be a damsel in distress, waiting for a faceless savior. She would not be a charity case, accepting handouts from the shadows. She needed to know who this was. She needed to see their face, to understand their motive. She formulated a plan. It was risky, but it was all she had. That evening, as the sun began to set, she hid herself. Not on the porch, but behind the crumbling stone wall of the old well, a spot that gave her a clear view of the path leading to the house but kept her hidden in deep shadow. She clutched a heavy rock in her hand, her knuckles white. She didn't know if she would have to fight, but she was ready. She would wait all night if she had to. She would unmask this ghost no matter what it took. The minutes stretched into an hour. The sky turned from orange to deep indigo. And then she heard it, the soft, steady rhythm of hoofbeats against the dry dirt. They were coming. The sound grew closer, slow and deliberate. Not the sound of a threat, but the sound of someone trying not to be heard. A tall figure on a dark horse emerged from the twilight, moving like a shadow himself. He dismounted smoothly, his boots making almost no noise in the thick dust. Eva's heart was a drum against her ribs. He was big, bigger than her father. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face, and a long duster that covered him from shoulder to heel. In his hand he carried another small bundle. He walked to the edge of the porch, placed the bundle in the usual spot, and then just stood there for a moment. He wasn't looking at the porch, or the pathetic fire. He was looking up at the house, at the broken windows and the sagging roof. It wasn't a look of pity, it was something else. Something she couldn't read. Then he turned, and for a split second, the faint moonlight caught his face. His features were hard, carved from the same unforgiving landscape as everything else in Dust River. He had a square jaw and eyes that seemed to hold the darkness in them. He looked dangerous, not like a savior, like a man who knew a thing or two about violence. He turned back toward his horse. It was now or never. "Why are you doing this?" The words ripped out of her throat, louder and harsher than she intended. The man froze. He didn't startle, didn't jump. He just went perfectly still, like a predator that has just scented its prey. He turned his head slowly, his face once again lost in the shadow of his hat. "You should be sleeping," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel scraping against stone. Eva stepped out from behind the well, the rock still heavy in her hand. "I asked you a question." He turned his whole body to face her now. He was taller than she'd thought. He made her feel small, fragile. "There are children here," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "That's not a reason," she shot back, her own voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "People don't help people out here. Not for nothing." He took a half step toward her, and she tightened her grip on the rock. He stopped. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Maybe not," he said, "but it's enough." She stared at him, trying to read the unreadable face in the dark. She didn't trust him, not for a second. This quiet, imposing man leaving gifts in the night, it didn't make sense. There was a piece of the puzzle missing. "I don't have a last name," she said, throwing the words at him like a challenge. It was a test. She wanted to see how he'd react. He just nodded once. "I didn't ask for one." Then without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off, melting back into the darkness as silently as he had come. Eva stood there for a long time, the rock still in her hand, her mind reeling. He hadn't threatened her. He hadn't asked for anything. And yet she was more afraid than ever. His name was Calder Reed. She knew that much from town gossip. A loner who kept to his ranch up in the hills. A man with no family, no friends, and no reason to help a handful of abandoned kids. His kindness felt like a lie. And she decided right then and there she would follow him. She would find out what secrets he was hiding up on that lonely ranch. She had a feeling her life and the lives of her siblings depended on it. The next morning, Eva made a decision that would change everything. She told her oldest brother Sam to watch the others, to stay hidden and not light a fire until she returned. Then she set off, following the faint trail of hoof prints that led away from her ruined home and up into the desolate rolling hills. The sun was merciless, beating down on her back, but she kept going, driven by a gnawing suspicion that was stronger than her hunger. Calder Reed was a ghost, and she was going to find out what he was haunting. His ranch was even more isolated than she'd imagined. It was a small, rugged homestead tucked into a shallow canyon, looking more like a fortress than a home. A simple cabin, a sturdy barn, and a corral, all built with a kind of rough, no-nonsense practicality. There was no sign of life, except for a thin curl of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. She crept closer, using the sparse cover of rocks and sagebrush, her heart pounding. What was she even looking for? She didn't know. A wife? Other children? Anything that would explain his strange, silent charity. She circled around to the back of the barn. The smell of hay and manure thick in the air. The large barn door was slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack, she saw him. He was working, mending a piece of leather tack, his movements economical and precise. He was alone. The barn was meticulously organized, tools hanging in their proper places, the floor swept clean. This was the home of a man who lived by routine and discipline. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something else. In the far corner, half hidden under a dusty canvas sheet, was the distinct shape of a small, wooden rocking horse. A chill went down her spine. A child's toy. In the home of a man who lived completely alone. She felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Where did it come from? And where was the child it belonged to? She backed away from the barn door, her mind racing with dark possibilities. This wasn't just a simple loner. There was a story here, a tragedy, and she had just stumbled right into the middle of it. Just as she was about to retreat, a floorboard inside the cabin creaked. She flattened herself against the barn wall, holding her breath. The cabin door opened, and Calder stepped out. He wasn't looking in her direction. He was walking toward the corral, his stride long and purposeful. This was her chance. She had to leave, to get back to her siblings before he realized she'd been there. But as she turned to go, she saw him stop. He was standing by the fence looking out at the vast empty prairie, and in that unguarded moment, she saw the look on his face. It wasn't the hard, unreadable mask he wore in the dark. It was a look of profound, soul-deep loneliness, a loneliness that she recognized because she saw it in her own reflection every single day. In that instant, her fear was replaced by a flicker of something else, something confusing and unwelcome. Empathy. She shook her head, angry at her own weakness. Empathy was dangerous. Trust was a death sentence. She had to get away, but it was too late. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping the area, and his eyes locked directly onto hers. There was no hiding. She was caught. He didn't shout. He didn't even look surprised. He just stared at her from across the dusty yard, his expression hardening again, becoming a stone wall. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Eva's first instinct was to run, but she didn't. She had come here for answers, and she wasn't leaving without them. Holding her chin high, she stepped out from behind the barn. She walked right up to him, clutching the bundle of blankets and tins he had left for them. She thrust it at him. "We don't need your charity," she said, her voice shaking but firm. He looked down at the bundle, then back at her face. He didn't take it. "It's not charity," he said, his voice flat. "Then what is it?" she demanded. "Why are you helping us? What do you want?" He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "You want to pay me back?" he asked, his voice low. "Fine. You can work for it." Eva blinked, stunned into silence. She had expected anger, suspicion, anything but this. "Work?" He gestured toward the barn. "You know how to muck out a stall? Tend to a horse?" "No," she admitted. A corner of his mouth twitched, a flicker of something that might have been a smile, but wasn't. "Good," he said. "You'll learn." And just like that, a line was drawn in the dust. It wasn't an offer of sanctuary. It was a challenge, a test. He was giving her a chance to earn her survival, not just accept it. She looked from his unyielding face to the lonely ranch, to the barn that held the secret of the rocking horse. She didn't trust him, but she was out of options. And for the first time in a long time, she had a choice that wasn't between starving and starving faster. Fine, she said, I'll work, but my family stays with me. He just nodded once. The barn is empty. You can sleep there. As she walked toward the barn, her siblings in tow, she felt his eyes on her back. She had survived the abandonment. She had survived the hunger. Now she had to survive Calder Reed. And she had a terrible feeling that would be the hardest test of all. She still didn't know what he was hiding, but she knew one thing for sure. The story of the man with the sad eyes and the child's rocking horse was far from over. The work was brutal. Calder Reed did not believe in easing into a task. From sunup to sundown, Eva's life became a blur of aching muscles and raw, blistered hands. She mucked out stalls, hauled buckets of water until her shoulders screamed, and learned to groom a horse with a brush that felt heavier than a boulder. Her siblings, too young to do the heavy lifting, were put in charge of weeding the small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin. Calder never offered a word of praise, never a moment of rest. He just watched, his face a stony mask, his silence more intimidating than any shouting. It felt like a punishment, and in a way it was. He was testing her, pushing her to her absolute limit, waiting to see if she would break. Every evening, she would collapse onto a bed of hay in the corner of the barn, her body a single, throbbing ache, and wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. She felt more like a prisoner than an employee. He would leave a pot of simple stew and a loaf of bread on the porch for them each night, but he never ate with them. He took his meals alone, inside his quiet, solitary cabin. One afternoon, while she was scrubbing a water trough, her youngest sister, Lily, toddled over to where Calder was repairing a fence post. Eva tensed, ready to snatch her back. Calder was a silent, looming presence, and she was terrified of what he might do. But Calder didn't shoo her away. He just kept working, his hammer rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Lily, full of a child's fearless curiosity, reached out and touched the rough denim of his jeans. Calder stopped hammering. He looked down at the tiny hand on his leg, and for a fraction of a second, his expression changed. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of pain so deep and raw, it made Eva catch her breath. It was the same look she'd seen when he stood by the corral. He didn't say a word. He just gently picked up Lily's hand, placed it back at her side, and then went back to his work, the stone wall firmly back in place. But Eva had seen it, a crack in the armor. Whatever haunted this man, it had to do with a child. A few days later, a new mystery began. Small things started appearing. One morning, a broad-brimmed hat, worn but sturdy, was sitting on the porch rail. It was too big for her brothers, clearly meant for her, a shield against the relentless sun. There was no note, no explanation. A week later, a pair of second-hand work boots appeared by the barn door, small enough to fit her, their leather softened with age. Then a brush for her hair, its handle made of carved wood, left on a crate next to their sleeping area. She never thanked him. He never acknowledged the gifts. It was a silent conversation, a language of objects instead of words. But it was confusing. He worked her to the bone, treated her with a cold distance, and yet he was providing for her in these small, thoughtful ways. Who was this man? Was he a cruel taskmaster or a secret protector? The two images refused to fit together. The breaking point came during a storm. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the rain came down in sheets, turning the dusty ranch into a sea of mud. The barn was drafty, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Lily came down with a fever, her small body burning hot, her cries weak and pitiful. Eva did everything she could, pressing cool, damp rags to her sister's forehead, but the fever wouldn't break. She was terrified. They were miles from town, with no medicine and no help. In a panic, she ran out into the lashing rain and pounded on Calder's cabin door. He opened it, his face unreadable in the flickering lantern light from within. "She's sick," Eva choked out, rain and tears streaming down her face. "My sister, she's burning up. I don't know what to do." For a long moment, he just looked at her, and she felt a surge of despair. He was going to turn her away. He was going to let her sister die. But then, without a word, he brushed past her and strode toward the barn, his long legs covering the muddy ground in seconds. He knelt beside Lily, his large, rough hand gently touching her forehead. He was so big, and she was so small and fragile. He looked at Eva, his eyes intense. "Keep her warm. I'll be back." He disappeared back into the storm. Eva waited, her heart lodged in her throat. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. When he returned, he was carrying a small wooden box. He opened it. Inside were various jars and bundles of dried herbs. He ground some of them into a paste, mixed it with hot water, and then, with a gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with his rugged exterior, he coaxed Lily to drink the bitter concoction. He sat with her for hours, changing the cloths on her head, murmuring low, soothing words that were too quiet for Eva to hear. Toward dawn, the fever finally broke. Lily's breathing evened out, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Eva was slumped against the wall, exhausted and overwhelmed with a dizzying mix of gratitude and suspicion. He had saved her sister's life. "Why?" "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He stood up, his shoulders stiff. "The fever is gone. She'll be weak for a few days." He started to leave, the silent, stoic man once more. "Wait," Eva said, getting to her feet. "The rocking horse, in the corner." He froze, his back to her. "What about it?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "Whose was it?" she pressed, her own fear giving way to a desperate need to understand. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the rain drumming on the barn roof. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air out of the room. "It was my daughter's," he said. "Her name was Sarah." He turned to face her, and in the pale light of the lantern, she saw that his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "There was a fire. My wife. And my daughter. They didn't make it out." The truth hit Eva with the force of a physical blow. The loneliness, the pain she saw in his eyes, the child's toy hidden under a sheet. It all clicked into place. He wasn't a monster. He was a man drowning in loss. And in her and her siblings, he saw the ghosts of the family he could no longer protect. "I'm so sorry," she breathed. He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "Get some sleep," he said gruffly, and then he was gone, leaving Eva in the quiet barn with her sleeping sister and the devastating weight of his secret. She finally understood. His cruelty was a shield, his silence was a scream, and his kindness was a penance. And she realized she had judged him completely wrong, but knowing his secret didn't make him less dangerous. A man with that much pain inside him was like a bottle of lightning, and she was living right in the heart of the storm. The revelation of Calder's past changed the air between them. The silence was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of a master and a servant, but the shared silence of two people who understood loss. He never spoke of his wife and daughter again, and Eva never asked. The rocking horse remained in the corner, a silent testament to the ghosts that haunted the ranch. But the work didn't stop. If anything, Calder seemed to push them harder, as if burying himself in labor was the only way to keep from drowning in his memories. Eva, however, was no longer just a survivor taking orders. She was a partner in this harsh, silent world. She started to anticipate his needs, fetching a tool before he asked for it, mending a tear in his shirt and leaving it on his porch. And he, in turn, began to trust her with more. He taught her how to read the sky for rain, how to track a stray calf, how to splint a horse's leg. They were lessons taught not with words, but with gestures, with a nod of the head or a guiding hand. The town of Dust River, however, was not so accepting. When Eva had to ride into town for supplies, she was met with suspicious stares and whispered insults. They saw a girl with no name living on a reclusive rancher's land, and they drew their own ugly conclusions. The sheriff, a portly man named Bartholomew Finch with a perpetually sour expression, made a point of stopping her one day outside the general store. "You the Hanley girl?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Eva's stomach clenched at the name. "I'm Eva. Heard your folks lit out. Left you and the others," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her boot. "Now you're shacked up with Calder Reed. You know people are talking." "Let them talk," Eva said, her voice colder than she felt. "I work for my keep." Finch laughed, a short barking sound. "That what he's calling it?" Reed's always been a strange one. Ever since that fire. You be careful, girl. A man with that much grief in him can turn mean in a heartbeat. The sheriff's words were a warning, but they also held a piece of information. The fire, Eva said, her voice steady. It wasn't an accident, was it? Finch's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected her to ask. He looked around, then lowered his voice. Some say it was raiders. Some say it was just a stove that went bad. But there were whispers. Calder had a dispute with some men over a water right. Ugly business. After the fire, those men disappeared. Just vanished. Calder said they moved on, but no one ever saw them leave. A cold dread washed over Eva. She had seen Calder's grief. She had seen his kindness. But she had also seen the hardness in him, the capacity for a kind of stillness that felt dangerous. What if Sheriff Finch was right? What if Calder's loss had twisted him into something more than just a grieving man? What if he was a killer? She rode back to the ranch, her mind in a turmoil. She looked at Calder differently now, searching for a sign of the darkness Finch had hinted at. Was the disciplined way he split wood the same way he would handle an enemy? Was the silence a sign of peace or of a terrible secret being held in check? She was living under the roof of a man who might be a murderer. The barn, once a shelter, now felt like a cage. That night she couldn't sleep. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. Those men disappeared. Driven by a terrifying new suspicion, she slipped out of the barn after everyone was asleep. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. She didn't know what she was looking for. A weapon? A trophy? A confession? She found herself drawn to a small, locked shed behind the main cabin, a place she'd never been told to enter. The lock was old and rusty. Using a piece of baling wire, she worked at it, her hands trembling. After a few tense moments, it sprang open. The shed smelled of dust and rust and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. She lit a match, its tiny flame pushing back the oppressive darkness. The shed was filled with old tools and broken equipment. Nothing out of the ordinary, but in the back corner, under a pile of rotting sacks, was a wooden chest. It wasn't locked. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of old cloth, were two items. The first was a tarnished silver locket, the kind a woman would wear. The second was a large, heavy revolver, its metal gleaming ominously in the matchlight. It looked clean, well-oiled, cared for. She picked up the locket and fumbled it open. Inside were two miniature portraits. One was a beautiful woman with kind eyes. The other was a smiling little girl with Calder's jawline. Sarah, his family. But why hide it in a locked shed with a gun? She put the locket down and reached for the revolver. It was heavy, a tool made for one purpose. As she picked it up, something fell out from where it had been wedged beside the chest. It was a piece of folded yellowed paper, a wanted poster. Her match went out, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for another, her hands shaking so badly she could barely strike it. The new flame flickered to life. She unfolded the paper. It was a crude drawing of a man with a scarred face and cruel eyes. The name printed beneath it was Jedediah Kane, and below that the words, "Wanted for arson and murder." It wasn't Calder. It was one of the men who had disputed the water rights, the man who had supposedly vanished. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind her. "You shouldn't be in here, Eva," she gasped, spinning around. Calder was standing in the doorway, a lantern in his hand, his face a mask of stone in the golden light. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the wanted poster in her hand. "He's the one who started the fire," Calder said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "He and his brother, they thought they could scare me off my land." He finally looked at her, his eyes hollowed out pits of pain. "They didn't know my family was in the cabin." "What happened to them?" Eva whispered, her throat tight. "The sheriff said they vanished." Calder's gaze dropped to the revolver lying in the open chest. "Justice in Dust River is a slow, lazy thing," he said, his voice a low growl. "Sometimes you have to find it yourself. They didn't vanish, Eva. I made them disappear." The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Calder Reed, the silent rancher, the grieving father, was a killer. He had taken his own revenge. He was everything Sheriff Finch had warned her about. And she, a girl with no name and no protection, had just uncovered his darkest secret. She was trapped on a remote ranch with a man who had killed two people with his bare hands. Her blood ran cold. He had saved her and her siblings. But what would he do to her now that she knew he was capable of murder? Eva's mind screamed at her to run, to grab her siblings and flee into the night. But where would they go? Back to starving on the porch? To a town that already despised them? She was paralyzed by the terrifying truth. Calder saw the fear in her eyes, the way her hand trembled as she held the wanted poster. He took a slow step into the shed. "I am not him," he said, his voice low and intense, gesturing to the poster. "I'm not a man who hurts women and children. I am the man who stops them." She wanted to believe him. The gentle way he had cared for Lily, the sad look in his eyes when he looked at the rocking horse. It all warred with the image of him as a cold-blooded killer. But the gun was right there, gleaming in the lantern light. The proof. "They burned my family alive, Eva," he continued, his voice cracking with a pain that was still fresh, still raw. "The law did nothing. Sheriff Finch called it a tragedy and closed the book. What would you have me do? Let them ride off and do it to someone else?" His question hung in the air, a direct challenge to her own sense of justice. She thought of her own parents, of the cruelty and neglect she had suffered. She thought of the men who had left her bleeding on the kitchen floor. If she had a gun that day, what would she have done? The answer scared her. Slowly she lowered the wanted poster. She looked at Calder, really looked at him, not as a monster or a savior, but as a man who had been pushed past his breaking point. She saw the grief, the rage, and the profound loneliness that had driven him to exact his own terrible justice. She didn't condone it, but in a place as harsh and unforgiving as Dust River, she understood it. "Your secret is safe with me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. A flicker of surprise, then relief crossed his face. It was the most emotion she had ever seen from him at one time. He nodded once, a gesture of gratitude that was more powerful than any words. He picked up the gun and the locket, placed them back in the chest, and closed the lid. He was burying his past again, but this time, she was a part of it. She was the keeper of his secret. This shared knowledge created a new, unbreakable bond between them. It was a dark, dangerous foundation, but it was solid. The dynamic on the ranch shifted again. There were no more tests, no more probing for weakness. He treated her as an equal. The children, sensing the change, began to orbit him more freely. Lily especially started to follow him everywhere, a tiny, chattering shadow. He never seemed to mind. He would sometimes even lift her onto his shoulders as he walked the fence line, a silent, towering man with a giggling child on his back. One afternoon, a wagon creaked up the path. It wasn't the sheriff this time. It was a man in a dusty black coat, introducing himself as the preacher from the town's tiny chapel. He had heard about the new children at the Reed place and had come to register them for school and Sunday service. He crouched down, smiling at the children. "And what are your names, little ones?" They answered one by one. Then came the question that made Ava's blood run cold. "And what is your family name?" the preacher asked kindly. The silence was deafening. Ava opened her mouth, but the hated name Hanley wouldn't come out. It felt like poison on her tongue. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Before she could force the word out, Lily stepped forward, her small chin held high. "Our name is Boone," she said, her voice as clear as a bell. The preacher blinked. "Pardon?" Lily pointed a confident thumb at Calder, who was leaning against a fence post, watching the scene unfold. "That's our family now. Uncle Calder is our home. So our name is Boone." Eva stopped breathing. She looked at Calder. His face was a mask of shock. It was as if the little girl's innocent words had cracked him wide open, letting a light into places that had been dark for years. He looked stunned, vulnerable, and overwhelmed all at once. Without a word, he turned and walked quickly into the barn, disappearing into the shadows. The flustered preacher mumbled something about coming back another time and hastily departed. Eva stood frozen, long after the wagon was gone. Lily's declaration had changed everything. It was a child's wish, a simple statement of fact from a girl who had decided where she belonged. That night, Calder didn't join them for the evening meal. Eva grew worried. Had Lily's words pushed him away? Had she reminded him too painfully of the family he'd lost? Later, she went to the barn to return a borrowed blanket. The lantern was burning low. As she stepped inside, she saw something new. Carved into the thick wooden beam above the horse stall, in fresh, clean letters, were two words. Ava Boone. There had been no discussion, no proposal. Just a name, carved into the heart of his home. A name she hadn't been born with, but one that had been offered. A name that meant belonging. A name that meant safety. She reached up and traced the letters with her fingers. For the first time when she whispered it aloud, it felt like it was hers. It felt like home. But she knew that in a town like Dust River, claiming a new name wasn't that simple. And she had a feeling that the ghosts of her past, the Hanleys, were not done with her yet. A name like that, once cursed, was not so easily left behind. The fragile piece of their new life was shattered on a Tuesday. The sky was a hazy, oppressive gray, promising a storm that refused to break. A strange wagon rumbled up the road, pulled by a mule so thin its ribs looked like a broken fence. On the seat sat a man with a greasy, slanted hat and teeth the color of old corn. Beside him sat a boy, barely 15, with a cruel smirk plastered on his face. As they got closer, Eva saw the crest stitched onto the man's coat. 3 crossed antlers. It was her mother's family emblem. Kin. Her body went rigid. The man climbed down from the wagon, his boots sinking into the dust like he owned it. "You must be Eva," he said, his voice slick and oily. "Loretta's girl. We heard what happened. Real shame." He didn't sound ashamed at all. "Thought we'd come fetch the little ones. Family ought to be with family after all." Before Eva could find her voice, the barn door creaked open, and Calder stepped out. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a gathering storm cloud. He wiped his hands on his jeans, his hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. "They aren't sacks of grain to be carted off," he said, his voice a low rumble. The man who introduced himself as Eva's uncle, Cyrus, gave a lazy shrug. "Not saying they are, just saying they got Hanley blood in them. We got land. They can work, eat better than they are here, living like squatters." Eva's stomach twisted into a knot of cold fury. Lily peeked out from behind her, clutching a small wooden bird Calder had carved for her. Cyrus's eyes flickered toward the child, a greedy, calculating look. "You don't get to vanish for years," Calder said, taking a step forward, "and reappear when your fence line needs mending. This isn't about blood. It's about who stayed when it rained." Cyrus's eyes narrowed into slits. "And who are you to say? You ain't her husband. You got no papers, no claim, just a name a little girl pulled out of the dirt. What gives you the right?" The air crackled with tension. Ava could feel Calder's rage, a palpable heat coming off him. She remembered the gun in the shed. She remembered his words. "I made them disappear." She quickly stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm, a silent plea. "Not this way." Calder's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. His voice dropped, low and dangerous. "I'm the one who showed up." It seemed for a moment that Cyrus might reach for the pistol tucked in his belt, but then a sound came from the road. The soft creak of a porch swing, a door clicking shut. Neighbors. The woman from the town bakery, the blacksmith, a few other ranchers. They had heard the shouting and had come to see. They stood there, silent figures watching from a distance, their arms crossed. They weren't taking sides, not yet. They were just watching. The whole of Dust River was holding its breath. The blacksmith, a burly man who had always been curt with Eva, spoke up, his voice booming across the yard. "I saw that girl carry 3 kids through a flood week last spring. I saw this man bring her firewood when no one else would." The baker's wife nodded. "They belong here. Boone isn't just a name around here anymore. It's what we call the ones who care for their own." Cyrus's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "So you'd let a girl choose a stranger over her own kin? Over blood?" Eva knew this was her moment. This was the true test. She let go of Calder's arm and stepped forward, her boots making a soft sound in the dust. She didn't look at Calder. She looked at Cyrus, at his greasy smirk and his cruel eyes. and she saw her father, her mother, a whole lifetime of pain. And then she looked out at the silent audience of townspeople. "He is not a stranger," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, with a power she didn't know she possessed. "He's the man who gave us a roof when we were sleeping in the dirt. He's the man who taught us how to work, not just how to bleed." Then she did something that shocked everyone, including herself. She turned, walked back to Calder, and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. It was a gesture of ownership, of choice. "I choose him," she declared, her voice unwavering. "I choose the man who carried our future instead of the man who cursed our past." The boy on the wagon spat into the dirt. "You're just a child," Cyrus hissed. "I was a child when you let my father beat me on the kitchen floor," Eva shot back, her voice like flint. "I was a child when my mother ripped her skirt from my sister's hand and drove away. I am not a child anymore." She squeezed Calder's hand, drawing strength from his solid presence. "And I don't belong to you. My name is Eva Boone. I chose it, and these are my people." A murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. It was a sound of approval, of acceptance. Cyrus stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He had come expecting to collect a few stray children like property, and instead he had run into a wall. A wall made of a silent, dangerous man, a fiercely protective girl, and an entire town that had finally decided to stand with him. He spat near Calder's boot, a final, pathetic act of defiance. He climbed back onto his wagon, and with a flick of the reins, rode away, disappearing into the same dust he'd come from. Eva stood there, her hands still locked in Calder's, her heart pounding with a triumphant, terrifying rhythm. She hadn't just won a battle. She had declared a war. She had publicly defied her bloodline. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that men like Cyrus Hanley did not forget. They did not forgive. This wasn't over. He would be back. And next time, he wouldn't be coming alone. The victory over Cyrus was short-lived. A new, colder fear settled over the ranch. Eva saw it in the way Calder constantly scanned the horizon, the way he cleaned his rifle every night, the way he bolted the cabin door. They had won the town's respect, but they had made a powerful enemy. The name Hanley wasn't just a mark of a bad family. Eva was beginning to suspect it was tied to something far more dangerous. Men like Cyrus didn't travel that far just for cheap labor. There was another reason he wanted them back, a secret. To distract from the constant tension, Eva threw herself into a new project. The barn. It had been their shelter, their home. Now she wanted it to be something more, a place of hope, a school. There were other children on the outskirts of Dust River, kids from poor families, orphans, outcasts, who had never learned to read or write their own names. She knew what it felt like to be nameless, and she was determined that no other child in this town would suffer the same fate. She and Calder cleared it out together. He lifted the heavy crates and repaired the broken benches, while she swept away years of dust and nailed old curtains over the windows to soften the light. It was hard work, but it was hopeful work. It felt like they were building a future, not just hiding from the past. On the first day of the Boone School, as the children called it, she wrote a single word on the old cracked blackboard: name. She taught the children to say their names with their heads held high, to spell them out like a declaration of their own worth. It was a small, defiant act against a world that had tried to render them invisible. Calder watched from the doorway of the barn, a strange, soft expression on his face. Later that day, he hung a new sign he'd carved himself above the barn doors. In blocky, uneven letters, it read, "Boone School, a place where everyone has a name." When Eva saw it, she felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. This man, this silent, grieving killer, had given her more than just a roof over her head. He had given her a purpose. He had given her a home. That night, long after the children had gone home and the barn was quiet again, Eva stayed behind to clean the slates. Calder came in, ostensibly to mend a broken bench, but she knew he was there to see her. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the shared trauma of their past and the uncertain hope for their future. He walked over to the desk where she was working and placed a folded piece of paper in front of her. It was an official document, A marriage application. His voice was gruff, almost hesitant. The preacher said, if we were official, it would be harder for anyone to take the children. It would give us a legal claim. Ava unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the formal text, but they stopped on the line for the bride's name. It was blank, but at the bottom of the page, Calder had written something in his sharp, deliberate hand. She can choose to carry my name, but I've been carrying her in my heart for a long time already. Eva's own heart seemed to stop. She looked up at him, into those eyes that had seen so much pain, eyes that had never demanded a single thing from her, but had offered her everything. You don't have to, he said quickly, misinterpreting her silence. This place, the school, it's yours, no matter what you decide. She stood up slowly, the paper clutched in her hand. She walked to the blackboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and erased the day's lesson. Then with slow, careful strokes, she wrote 2 words, Eva Boone. She turned back to face him, her voice soft but clear as starlight. I don't carry shame anymore, she said. Just the name I chose, and the one you made room for. A slow smile spread across Calder's face. It was the first real, genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, less burdened. He walked over, gently took the chalk from her hand, and drew a single steady line underneath her name. Not a period, not an exclamation point, just a line. For the rest of our story, he murmured. She reached out and took his calloused hand, the hand that had worked and fought and killed and protected. Together they stood in the quiet barn, 2 broken people who had found a way to build something whole. Outside, the wind whispered of coming storms, and the threat of Cyrus Hanley still loomed on the horizon. But inside the barn, where a school had bloomed from ruins and 2 names now stood side by side, a fire was burning that no storm could ever extinguish. They would face whatever was coming, not as 2 lonely souls, but as a family. And the Boones were just getting started. Their wedding day wasn't a grand affair. It was a simple gathering under the vast Texas sky, right beside the barn that had become the heart of their world. Neighbors came from all over, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine respect for the family that had been forged in hardship. Eva wore a simple dress sewn by the women of the town, and Calder wore his only clean shirt. They didn't exchange fancy rings or recite flowery vows. Their promises were simpler, more real. I don't need someone who shares my blood, Calder said, his voice loud and clear for all to hear. I just need someone who brings fire home and keeps it burning. Eva, with Lily holding her hand on one side and her oldest brother on the other, looked out at the faces in the crowd. A name is something you're born with, she said, her voice steady and strong. But a place in this world, that's something you have to earn. Today, I choose mine. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, they didn't seal it with a kiss for the crowd. They sealed it with a quiet look, a shared understanding that said everything that needed to be said. We are home. But even in the midst of the celebration, a shadow lingered. A rider from a neighboring ranch brought news. Cyrus Hanley had been seen in the next county, and he wasn't alone. He was gathering men, telling a twisted story about a crazed rancher who had kidnapped his kin. He was painting Calder as a villain and himself as a grieving uncle trying to rescue his family. He was building an army. The law, slow and indifferent, wouldn't get there in time. Cyrus was coming to wipe the Boone name off the map, and he was bringing a war with him. The celebration ended abruptly. The festive mood was replaced by a grim sense of purpose. The men of Dust River didn't run. The blacksmith, the ranchers, the store owner, they stood with Calder. They had seen his character. They had seen Eva's strength. The Boones were theirs now, and they would not let them be taken. They spent the next few days fortifying the ranch, turning the homestead into a makeshift fort. Barricades were built, rifles were cleaned, lookouts were posted. Eva refused to be sidelined. She learned how to load a rifle, her hands quick and steady. She organized the women, preparing food, water, and medical supplies. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a leader, defending her home, her school, her family. In the tense quiet before the battle, Calder found her staring out at the horizon. You should take the children and hide in the hills, he said. his voice rough with worry. She turned to him, her eyes blazing. You taught me how to mend a fence, how to track a calf, and how to stand my ground. I'm not running. We built this home together, Calder. We will defend it together. The attack came at dawn. Cyrus and a dozen hired guns rode out of the morning mist, their faces grim, their intentions clear. They had expected to find a lone rancher and a handful of children. They were not prepared for the unified resistance of an entire town. The first shots rang out, and the battle for Boone Ranch began. It was a brutal, chaotic fight. Gunsmoke filled the air, and the sounds of shouting and gunfire echoed through the canyon. Calder was a force of nature, moving with a deadly calm, his shots precise and deliberate. He was not just fighting for his land, he was fighting for the second chance at a family he never thought he'd have. Eva, stationed at a window in the cabin, fired alongside him, her fear replaced by a cold, protective fury. She was fighting for the name she had chosen, for the future of the children who finally had a place to belong. In the heat of the battle, Cyrus managed to break through their defenses, kicking open the cabin door. He lunged for Eva, his face a mask of rage. You and your filthy whelps are Hanley property, he snarled. Before he could lay a hand on her, Calder was there. The two men collided in a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle. It wasn't a gunfight anymore. It was a primal battle of wills. Just as Cyrus reached for a knife, a shot rang out, not from Calder's gun, but from the doorway. Sheriff Finch stood there, a smoking pistol in his hand, a posse of deputies behind him. He had gotten the news and had ridden all night. Cyrus clutched his shoulder, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. She's my kin, he screamed. No, the sheriff said, his voice cold as iron. She's a citizen of this town, and we protect our own. The fight was over. Cyrus and his men were arrested, their twisted plans brought to ruin. As the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the people of Dust River emerged, battered but victorious. They had stood together, not for land or money, but for a principle, for the idea that a family is defined by heart, not just by blood. In the aftermath, Eva and Calder stood on their porch, looking out at the home they had almost lost. The children ran out to them, safe and sound. Lily wrapped her arms around Calder's leg, and he lifted her up, holding her close. Eva looked at the sign above the barn, scarred but still standing. Boone School, a place where everyone has a name. They had earned it. They had fought for it. The ranch was rebuilt, stronger than before. The school flourished, becoming a beacon of hope for the entire region. The name Eva Boone became a legend in that corner of Texas. Not the story of a girl who was abandoned, but the story of a woman who built a family, a home, and a future from nothing but grit and love. She had faced down the ghosts of her past and had chosen her own destiny, proving that the strongest ties aren't the ones you're born with, but the ones you're willing to fight for. If this story reminded you that family isn't always about blood, but about who shows up when it rains, then you belong here with us. We tell the stories of the Wild West, where courage is currency and love is the law of the land. Stories of people who refuse to be defined by their past and instead choose to build their own future. One act of kindness, one brave stand at a time. If you believe in second chances and the power of a chosen family, then hit that subscribe button and join our posse. There are countless stories waiting by the fire, and we'd be honored to share them with you. Don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss a tale from the heart of the frontier.